Good evening. This evening we've got one of those topics, and when I say one of those topics, I mean one that's a little bit out there, and there's a reason that we're going to address it, but let me say two things as we get started with it. Number one, there's a time when addressing particular topics where it is appropriate and right for us to approach it with tenderness and with speaking the truth in love as we always want to. But there are other times where we just need to study through a particular topic because there are dangers involved in it, and we can recognize those. And so there can be a time where we approach it with the empathy and the love that are necessary, and another time where we just need to address one part of it. Well, tonight we're addressing one part of a larger issue. And the larger issue, mostly of what we're dealing with, is homosexuality. But the particular issue is this, that there are those who make an argument, it's fairly common at least, to make this argument that because we see homosexual behavior, take that how you will, in nature, that is among the animal kingdom, that could justify that same type of behavior in humans. And so if you've never heard that argument before, then this is your introduction to it. But for those of you that have heard that argument made, this is our time to address that. And that's why I say from the beginning, this is not a lesson on how we deal in love with people who struggle with these things. There is a time and a place for that. But we're addressing this very specific argument that is made, this appeal that's made to this particular idea. So what we want to do first is we want to make sure that we're all on the same page as far as what's being suggested here and why, and then we'll try to work through it as far as what the Bible would say directly, but then we'll kind of say why, even if the Bible didn't say anything against it, it really wouldn't be a good argument anyway. And so we'll come back around to that and make a few applications toward the end. But the first thing we have to do is look at the one underlying assumption that this argument makes, that really the world makes these days, because they appeal to a specific line of thinking about the origin of mankind. And of course, you know that most people in the world today, it would seem at least, or in this nation especially, believe that man evolved from a lower life form, a common ancestor with animal kind. And so the assumption that's made is that we as humans are no different, morally speaking, socially speaking, than any animal in the world. And obviously, if that's your belief, then you might be able to go to nature to justify human behavior. If your belief, however, is that God created man different from animals, then there's really no correlation between animal behavior and the behavior of mankind. But if evolution were true, then in theory, whatever is right for one animal is right for another animal. And if we're just an animal, then there's really no difference in how we treat each other versus how dolphins treat each other, versus how dogs treat each other. It would all be the same. Basically, the argument would go, it's found in nature, therefore it must be natural. It can't be against nature if you can find it in nature. So the real logical breakdown of the argument is mankind and animal kind have equitable behaviors. That is, you can look at mankind, you can look at animal kind and see that one would justify the other. And we see, the second point here would be, and we see homosexual behavior in animals. That's the next thing we'll talk about. And then their conclusion would be, therefore, you can justify homosexual behavior in humans. Okay, so all of that could be true if, as evolution would suggest, we are just the next step up from primates, or we're just a little more evolved than the next animal down the line. So the other side of this, though, that we have to address is, do we see this in nature? Obviously, the claim is that, from their perspective, that we see this kind of behavior in nature. And it kind of depends on how you define it. Because, as we will talk about later on in the lesson, terms like homosexual are very specific to humans. It's a human idea. It's a study into human thought and emotion. It has nothing to do with animals, so that's already a problem. But if you're talking about same-sex behavior among animals, whether that be actual sexual activity or courtship behavior, do we see that in animals? Yes, we do. Okay, so that may sound far-fetched from the beginning, but if you have pets, potentially you've seen this, especially if you've ever kept cattle, you should already know that this exists, because it's not uncommon, but it's not common either. And so again, we're talking about across the animal kingdom here, and we do see this observed. So whether we're talking about birds, we will see some, again, same-sex sexual behavior or courtship behavior, meaning finding of partners. And we see this with primates, we see this with reptiles, we see this with whales, we see this kind of across the board. That being said, it is not common. So I don't want to give you the impression that this is something that's so wildly rampant in the animal kingdom that it should be obvious that it should happen in the world of humans. That's not the case. It's still quite rare. The numbers are, of course, terribly hard to get any real grasp on, but let's say it's 3% of behavior that we see in that context among animals. Even if that is the case, we'll have to ask what that would even prove. But the problem is that to justify what we're talking about tonight, that is homosexual relationships between humans, things like gay marriage in particular, it's not enough to look to the animal kingdom and find random acts of same-sex behavior. That doesn't prove anything. All that proves is some kind of sexual anarchy among animals. Well, that's not very helpful if you're building a case for a relationship to be made between people of the same sex and humans. So what we would need to find is something that's all the more rare in the animal kingdom, which is same-sex monogamy. That is a relationship between two animals of the same sex, the same gender, that is on a continual basis. Now that is found quite rarely as an exception, but is almost non-existent. And so that's the first problem that you're going to have. I won't get any more detailed than that, although there is one. Okay, I'll skip that. So the other problem, though, is the severe limitation of this kind of observation in the first place. And there's really two problems. One, serious scientific studies of animals are limited to about the last couple centuries. We've always watched animal behavior. We've always kind of kept an eye on the animals around us as humans. But any kind of serious research into animal behavior is pretty recent. Now, if you're talking about research into same-sex animal behavior, how recent do you think that research is? We're talking the last couple of decades. And beyond that, how many of you have ever tried to watch an animal behave in any way for an extended period of time? How easy is it to get an idea, even if you have 10 bird feeders and a dozen bird houses in your backyard, how much actual activity and behavior of birds do you get to watch before they fly away and you don't see them for a while? And so part of the problem with this kind of observation is it relies on non-repeatable chance observation, which means that you know nothing of the actual stimuli involved here. You know nothing of the background of these particular animals. You know nothing that's affecting their behavior. You just get to see the tiniest of glimpses. And so you have a very recent field of study, and you have a very narrow window of observation to the point that this becomes close to unscientific in the first place before we ever actually get to the behaviors themselves. Okay, let's move away from all that for just a minute and state what needs to be stated obviously for us as Christians, which is that we don't believe that in the first place, most of these things. We can observe the same things in nature, but we have a foundation in the Bible which tells us some pretty clear facts. The first one being this, that there is no right or wrong without God. So when people look to the animal world and they try to justify their behavior, meaning they try to make their behavior appear to be right or to be wrong, that doesn't really mean anything unless there is a basis for what is right and what is wrong. Well, God provides that basis. He tells us that what He says to do is right, what He says not to do is wrong. But if you take God out of the picture, then what does it even mean for homosexuality to be right? There is no right. It's not right, it's not wrong, it's just something that happens if there is no God. Because there is no morality without God. Nothing is right, nothing is natural, nothing is unnatural without God. And so this whole attempt to justify the behavior is kind of strange. You don't really need to justify behavior except that you might have a sneaking suspicion or part of your conscience that says that this is wrong and feeling the need to defend it. Now, it's more complicated than that, but all we're saying is homosexuality in general, in humans, it can't be right or wrong, it can't be natural or unnatural without a lawgiver, without someone who makes it right or wrong in the first place. But the second thing, this comes from the text that was read for us in Romans chapter 1. The phrase that it uses in verse 26, that God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Well, what God has said is natural is natural. What God has said is unnatural is unnatural. All we're doing is agreeing with what Paul has recorded for us here. But God, the creator of nature, determines what is natural. He's made it perfectly obvious in the case of Romans 1 what was natural and what these people were doing, which was unnatural. He's talking about that specifically in the world of humanity. He's not addressing the animal kingdom here, and it may not even apply to the animal kingdom the same way that it does to man, which is kind of our next point here. These parallel statements are similar, but a little bit different. The first one being this, that humans are not animals. Again, this is just the simple Christian perspective. Humans are not animals. How do we know? Because God made animals, and God made humans independent of animals. Not only that, but of course, according to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, He created them in His image, in His likeness. And so He formed them differently from the animals. He formed them with an eternal soul. He formed them with a conscience. He formed them with a resemblance to Himself, and most importantly among all of that, He formed them with a responsibility to Him. Do animals have a responsibility to God? Sort of. In a way, they still answer to Him. He told them to be fruitful and multiply. They have some responsibility to Him, but He didn't give them the same commands that He gave to man. And so the other side of this, humans are not animals, but just as much so, animals are not humans. That is to say that they are not expected to act in the same way that mankind is expected to act. God made them both. He is their creator for both. But that doesn't mean that they have the same set of regulations. It doesn't mean they have the same set of expectations from God. And so it would be wrong of us, from the biblical perspective, to suggest that what God demands of one group, He demands from the other. It's just not logical to act that way. And so we could even write some of this behavior off that we're talking about tonight as saying, well, that's not a command to animals. That's a command to humans. I don't think that's the best argument, but you could make that argument just based on what we've said. But animals do perform within a certain set of parameters, I suppose, but just consider the difference between what God allows or expects there versus in humans. God expects that animals will prey on one another, right? He expects that some of them will eat some of the others. He doesn't necessarily expect that among humans. I'm talking about even of the same species among animal kind, which we wouldn't expect among humans. But that's just part of the difference. Animals and man are expected to act according to God's purpose for them, not for God's purpose for the other group. But God has created them independent of one another. Okay, so like we said at the beginning, we will address the issue itself and what the Bible says, but we also want to say now that even if you remove God from this whole question, the question still doesn't really make a lot of sense. And there's a few reasons that we're going to point out for that. The first reason goes back to something that we kind of already mentioned, that what we're doing is blending two categories together that really don't fit together. And so the first reason this doesn't work is because when you look at animals and try to, we'll use the big word of anthropomorphize, but what we mean is when you start to look at animals as if they were humans, then you've lost all scientific basis already. Because when you start to call a behavior in animals homosexual, you're applying a human term developed from human sociology and psychology that has no bearing and no background in animals, but you're trying to put it on them anyway. It'd be kind of like saying if you had a monkey that you kept and you taught it to count bananas, and it could count to 3 somehow. It could number these bananas, and you said that that monkey is performing accounting. That's not possible, because accounting is a purely human creation. It's a purely human idea that monkeys, they just don't fit into that. And so what you're doing is committing a category fallacy here, where you're taking apples and oranges and saying, oh, these two things are equal to one another. Well, that's just not the way it works. And again, when you start to act that way, and you start to ascribe human emotion, human motivation, any of these things to animals, you've crossed the line from what is observable and testable in science to really mushing two things together that can't go. A scientific observation with a human idea that doesn't fit there. The second thing, and we already mentioned this as well, but we'll bring it up again, is that we are impossibly ignorant of this whole field. Meaning that we just don't have the information to actually make this suggestion with any certainty. So what we mean is to confirm homosexuality in animals, that is, that they have intentional same-sex behavior the same way that humans do, which is necessary to justify what they're trying to justify with this argument, we would need to fully understand animal sexuality as a whole. Do we understand animal sexuality as a whole? We really don't. We have just the tiniest idea of what happens, but not the motivations behind it. Can we know the motivations behind what animals are doing? Can we discern what are primal impulses from what are actual emotions? Can we determine any kind of integrity that they might have, any kind of sense of permanent relationships that they have? And again, no, you just can't know any of these things about animals. And so what we end up doing is equating instinctive animal behavior to human emotional behavior. That really doesn't prove anything anyway. All you're proving is that animals act instinctively, but even if you can prove that, it wouldn't make it morally right for them, and it certainly wouldn't make it morally right for mankind to engage in the same sorts of behavior. But there's a couple other things that I think are maybe even stronger arguments against this idea. One comes from the idea of evolution itself, that from an evolutionary perspective, if all that's true, then mankind is the pinnacle of evolution. We have arrived at a higher plateau than any other animal has found. What that means then is that when you go to observe other animals, then they are all lower life forms than you, right? Well, if they're lower life forms and you're the most evolved, then why would you want to imitate the behavior of something that's less evolved than you are? Why would you go there to justify the behavior that you're seeking out? It'd be kind of like saying, well, if we evolved from a common ancestor with fish and they don't have legs, should we seek to not have legs? Doesn't make a lot of sense. Most animals don't communicate as well as we do. Should we stop speaking to one another because lower life forms are not speaking to one another? And so again, it's not a great argument. But along with that, the argument is self-defeating in a very practical way. That is to say that when it comes to this argument, that if survival of the fittest has any value, which is one of the major underpinning points of evolution, if there's any truth to survival of the fittest, then this behavior is not going to survive, right? If the entire goal, according to evolution, is for life to pass on its genetic information to a new generation, if the whole point is to reproduce, if that's the goal of evolutionary life, then homosexual behavior in animals does not produce more life. It does not pass on genetics. It is incapable of doing so. And so survival of the fittest would work against this very principle. It would not be logical, and it would ultimately be a detriment to reproduction. And so as far as you can say something is right or wrong in nature, if anything, this seems to be wrong in nature, because it fails to accomplish the one goal that evolution has set out for life, which is to reproduce and create more life. The one other thing that we'll say, as far as arguments against this, is that when we make this appeal, ultimately what it's appealing to is natural law. That is the law of nature, the law of the way that we see things work. But the problem is that logically, eventually, that removes any law. So if you get rid of God's law and you start appealing to the law of nature and you say, well, if I can observe this in nature, then it must be okay for man to do. Well, what other behaviors are observed in nature that are part of nature's law? If you start to look around the animal kingdom, you're going to start to see incest. You're going to start to see infant cannibalism. You're going to see patricide, kind of the reverse of that. You're going to see pedophilia. You're going to see any number of things take place in animals. And so the question is, if you are really thinking that animal behavior can justify behavior in humans, where do you draw the line and how do you draw that line? And it's going to be a pretty tricky situation, because ultimately what this argument does is it appeals to one particular behavior that we find in animals and ignores the rest. But if you're going to take one and say that it's natural, if it's from nature, then it must be right, then you're going to have to take the rest of them if you're going to be logically consistent. Not that that's necessarily the concern of a lot of people that would make this argument. But I will say that I've also seen this argument extended in an even more twisted way, a more wicked way, which is that some look to the animal kingdom and see that some parents will kill their newborn animal children. And so what's the logical conclusion there? Well, if we see abortion take place in the animal kingdom, then obviously it's only natural to see that in the human world as well. So this argument can go even farther and in even darker directions if people are willing to take it there. So that is the argument. That's the response, biblically speaking, but even more so, it's the response just logically speaking, that this doesn't really hold up that well. And so we'll say a couple of things about it as we kind of wrap up. The first is this, that if you've never heard this argument, then again, this has just been your introduction, but if you have, or really either way, but don't let arguments like this shake you, because they're not good arguments to start with. They're not supportable from science, they're not supportable from logic, they're not supportable in any way. And in this case in particular, we will say this, that while this argument is popular among people who are just vaguely aware of the idea and are just looking for an excuse, people will promote this. But among biologists, among zoologists, they won't touch it because they recognize, generally speaking, that this is just not how it works, that something happening over here is unrelated to something happening over here. Just because it happens among animals, that doesn't mean that it happens among humans the same way, or that it should. It's just not, there is no correlation. And so again, anyone who's serious into the study of these things, they're usually unwilling to make comment on it because they recognize how far away it is from reality. But as an appeal to people who are looking for a way to rationalize their behavior, it seems like a good idea until you start to dig a little bit deeper into it. Again, we want to give this caveat because if this lesson is coming to you as someone who struggles with this behavior, that is homosexual behavior in humans, then this lesson sounds pretty harsh. It sounds pretty, maybe more than direct even. But what I want to point out is that this lesson ultimately has not been very much about homosexual behavior in humanity. It really hasn't been. It's been about homosexual or same-sex behavior, rather, in animals. That's all we're talking about tonight. And that's our only goal, is to say, listen, I understand why people make the argument, but it's a faulty argument because A, B, and C. And so we've tried to do that tonight. But again, there is a place for love. There's a place for empathy in the discussions that we have with people who struggle against this in terms of humanity, not in the animal world. But there's also, as we've discussed plenty of times, no love to be found in false comfort either. There's no love to be had when we say, oh, well, we know that God has spoken against this. He's made it perfectly clear in Romans chapter 1, among other places. And then to say, and maybe that's okay. We don't get to say that. We don't get to show love by doing that, by being tolerant as the world expects. But instead we show love by telling people what God has told us. The other thing that we want to say as a reminder of what we've said is that there is nothing that is natural about what God has called unnatural. And we go to Romans chapter 1 again, verse 28. Verse 28, it says, "And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge," that is, they liked to forget about God, "God gave them over to a debased mind to do things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness, and whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters." All of these things. And when we look at all of these things, there's one thing that they have in common. These sins and the furtherance of these sins and the more that they grow, all of that happens when people choose to forget God. So you look at a nation like ours that at one point was much more turned toward God than today, but then you look at decades and decades, probably a century at this point, of people slowly turning away, willfully forgetting God, as the text says. And what do you expect? That eventually they'll turn even to the animal world and they'll say, you know what? Maybe that behavior can justify my desire. What God has really said is just a giving over to in the first part of this text, in verse 27, leaving the natural use and instead burning in their lust for one another. God says, this isn't what's natural. This is what happens when you forget me, you turn away from me, and you obey your own lust, your own desire. And then you look for a way to justify it, and we end up with arguments like the one that we've looked at tonight. The one thing that we will say, as a way sort of comfort as we close out, is that while God is willing to give people over to their sin once they've turned so far away from Him, He is also always willing to take them back, if they will, if they'll come back. In James chapter 4, verse 8, God says, "Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you." This evening, that's your encouragement, that's your invitation to say, that while we've looked at this as a study of a particular argument, defending a particular behavior, for us individually, all of these things come back to one point, which is that God desires us. And we have to desire God more than we desire anything else, especially the things that we want. But tonight, if you're willing to draw near to God, then He will draw near to you. That means that tonight, if you've never been a child of His, you have an opportunity to be an obedient believer, following His plan of salvation. Or tonight, if you have strayed away, then all you have to do is draw near again, and He will return to you. This evening, if there's anything we can do, we ask that you come forward now as we stand, as we sing.